Welcome back. Today we're going to start talking about some African societies, and we're going to start with ancient Egypt, or sometimes called Pharaonic Egypt, Egypt under the pharaohs. Um, I've taught this class for a long time. I didn't used to include Egypt in here, mostly because I figured, okay, if there's information out there about any society, you can find out about Egypt, right? Um, but I think it is important to include for a number of reasons. To start with, I think the reason that your textbook talks about, and that is a lot of people don't think of Egypt as African. It is. Hopefully, this map makes that point pretty well. And this is actually a picture. If you maybe you recognize this, is a picture I took in the Field Museum here in Chicago. It's a nice map on the wall on the entryway there. Um, so Egypt is definitely an African society. At the same time, something that it talks about on here as well, Egypt was a crossroads in the ancient world. So there's going to be a lot of people, ideas, influences, etc., passing back and forth between Egypt, because it is this crossroads here. As we see between Africa, Asia here, and Europe. Okay, and it is also part of a Mediterranean world, but it is most definitely African. And some of the things that I'm going to emphasize about Egypt are things we will see in other African societies. I think there's certain commonalities there, so we'll talk about that more down the road here. Um, there's your textbook also talks about identity and race in ancient Egypt and so on. And there was a diversity of people in ancient Egypt. There's no doubt about that. Some looked very dark, sub-Saharan African-like, but for the most part, Egyptians, as you can see with these tomb paintings in the back here, these sculptures that are painted, they painted themselves kind of a reddish color, kind of pretty much what this guy looks like today, right? That said, some were lighter, some were darker, and as you might imagine, in a place where people are coming and going from different parts of the world. So the other reason to talk about ancient Egypt, besides emphasizing it as African, is it really is a place of firsts in African history. Okay, it's the first place we see agriculture. It's the first place we see cities. It's the first place we see writing, and it's the location of the first centralized states in African history. So Egypt has a lot of things for us to look at there. All right. The other major points we'll hit on are about the importance of the Nile, the operation of Egyptian agriculture, including irrigation, crops, and procedures. So this builds off of our study last week about farming and agriculture. The social organization of labor, including the development of patron-client relationships that I will explain. And yes, we'll talk some about pyramids, okay? Because you got to talk about pyramids, right? Well, the other reason to talk about Egypt, I guess, is a personal one for me. Egypt was the first place I went to in Africa. When I was in college, my parents actually moved to Egypt and then ended up living there for about 8 years. So I had a chance to go there and spend some time, and it's really one of the things that helped, really made me want to study African history, because Egypt is just such an incredible place and so much history, of course. So if you wonder why this really, really white guy got into African history, this is one of the reasons here, okay? Study of Egypt and being able to travel there and so on. Anyway, all right, so what do we got here? One of the main things is about the Nile, okay? Egypt is the land of the Nile. Always was, still is today, right? And you see then on this map where the Nile is. First thing to know about the Nile, though, is from our perspective, the Nile flows backwards. All right, we're used to our rivers going from north to south. The Nile flows from the south to the north. All right. Secondly, there's actually two Niles. There's what's called the Blue Nile. It starts here in Ethiopia at Lake Tana here, flows down around here, and flows then, once again, flows north up this way. Then there's the White Nile here that gets its start down in Uganda, actually where I used to live, right there out of Lake Victoria, and then flows up through South Sudan, once again north up here. So you got the Blue Nile from Ethiopia, the White Nile from Uganda and Sudan, and then they meet right here. And then from here downriver, it's just referred to as the Nile. All right? Okay. Two other things on this map to show you. One is there's a series of what are known as cataracts. These are rocky waterfalls, rocky parts in the river. And they're numbered 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 right here. And the first cataract right here is the traditional boundary between Egypt to the north and Nubia to the south. Although, as we'll see, that boundary shifted over time. All right. The last thing to point out on this map is the floodplain. What happens is, we'll see, your textbook talks about where the water, especially out of the Blue Nile, comes down the Nile here, and through here it's cut into a channel, like a canyon, so the waters can't escape. But as it gets down past the fourth cataract here, there is no more canyon, and you have what's called the floodplain because the river floods on either side, all the way down until it hits the Mediterranean. Okay, so the Nile floodplain is going to be very important. Here you can see it in a little bigger picture here. Once again, the highlands of Ethiopia, Lake Tana, and you see where the Blue Nile comes down this way. The White Nile flows further. We can't even see it on this map. It's another 600-700 miles south of there, I think. Anyway, but we'll see a number of states emerge then from, well, starting in about 3000 BC, so that's about 5,000 years ago, okay? A long time. Most of them all along the Nile. And why is that? Well, that's where we conclude the importance of the Nile, because we see state after state emerging along the Nile. There's something here, obviously, that makes it easier or attractive for them to form states. We'll see what that is here. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is context. Historians talk about context. That means big picture stuff. What else is going on at the time in the world or in this area? And what's going on in this area is drying out of the environment. I showed you in that first Introduction to Africa presentation that what is today the Sahara Desert wasn't. You go back 6, 7, 8,000 years, and it wasn't a desert at all. But it starts forming during this time. So this whole area of northern Africa is going to start being drier and drier. And when the environment gets drier and drier, it can't support population. So people have to move. Where are you going to go? Well, you're going to go where the water is, right? And that means a lot of people heading to the valley of the Nile River. All right, so we're going to start to see populations forming and population densities increasing here along the Nile. That's important historical context. What else is going on here? All right. Yeah, if we go back even further, as I said, 9,000 BC or so, there's no desert at all. All right. Right. So increasing drying out of the environment means increasing importance of the Nile River. Okay? And I said the Nile River about 15 times already in this presentation. So hopefully you're understanding that it's important, right? Okay. Now, as I said, it gets its start in the highlands of Ethiopia here. I traveled there as well. I think I got a picture of it here. Yep, this is a picture I took in Ethiopia here. And the highlands of Ethiopia, and what you see, if you take a look very closely, I hope you're not looking at this on your phone, but on a computer or something, you can tell. Look at the dirt here. This is very rich volcanic soils. And this is the Blue Nile, basically the start of the Blue Nile here in the highlands of Ethiopia. And what happens is during the rainy season, the rains wash this really fertile soil off these hillsides, off these mountains, of course, because water, runs down, takes the mud with it, and into the Blue Nile. Okay? And then, whoops, let me go back to a map here. And then that Blue Nile will take not just the water, but that fertile soil all the way downstream. Okay? Until it hits this floodplain. And then it's going to flood and burst over the banks on either side of the river. Okay? flooding that area, so water definitely, but also the mud. And that's what's really important here. Because as I told you in last week's video presentation about farming, in most places, especially in tropical Africa, the soils are not very good. They get worn out. You can grow a crop on them for about 3 years or so. Then they're worn out and you have to clear new land, which is very backbreaking labor, right? Okay. The ancient Egyptians didn't have to do that. Why not? Because this flooding of the river miraculously, and they attributed this, of course, to supernatural forces, but miraculously renewed the land every year, assuming the rains didn't fail in Ethiopia, which sometimes they did. But for the most part, when the river was high and it flooded and you had this soil there, your fields were just fertilized for you. And you could grow on the same land year after year after year. That's key, okay? Because we're going to see the growth of cities. Well, when you start seeing cities, we're talking about building, right? For the most part. Well, you can't move a city every 3 years, right? you can't do it. And especially the Egyptians are going to start constructing monumental architecture, huge monuments out of stone. Well, you're not going to be moving pyramids, right? Okay, so really what the key to ancient Egyptian society and ancient Egyptian civilization is the Nile. And it's the flooding of the Nile, and it's the farming based on the flooding of the Nile. All right? Because that's going to give you your crop surplus, which is going to lead to everything else. All right? So that's why they say Egypt is the land of the Nile, or the gift of the Nile, because without the Nile, you wouldn't have this civilization. There's a reason why this developed in the time and place it did. Okay? All right. So we saw see here where the water comes from and the soil in Ethiopia. And then there's a picture showing irrigated fields in Egypt. So what they did is, and still do, is build these little walls around the fields so that when the water floods and the water and mud floods across the field, it's retained in there. It doesn't just, drain off. Okay, then you can start growing. And you see, I think this is a pretty dramatic example of that. Over here, what do you have? You got desert. Okay, and then where the irrigation is, as you can see in the back here, boom, it's green. And it's just like that in Egypt. There's literally a line in the sand. One side where there's irrigation, it's green, farming, etc. On the other side, it's desert. Okay, and of course, it's even worse now because of that drying out of the environment over the centuries here. Okay. All right. So importance of the Nile, certainly as a water source, irrigation for agriculture, one of my favorite. I love talking about agriculture. Okay. But the Nile is important for other things too. Communications. Okay. Government control. Everybody is going to be crowded within a couple of miles of the Nile. That means government control can develop because you can get in a boat, you can sail up and down the river, okay, and be in touch with people without going long distances overland, okay? That's also going to help trade, okay? Now, the current in the Nile flows from the south to the north, but the prevailing winds in the area go from the north to the south. That means if you're in a boat on the Nile, you can float downriver from south to north, or you can sail upriver from north to south. It's a very easy way to travel back and forth, okay? And I've been on the Nile in boats several times. Well, once when the wind died and the guys had to get out the oars and start paddling. All right, but hopefully, if the winds stay, right? Anyway, okay. Now, the downside of all that water, though, is disease. Okay? A lot of tropical diseases, a lot of African diseases are tied to water one way or the other. We've got malaria, okay? Parasitic disease spread by mosquitoes that, are breed and are born in water. You have to have standing water. Schistosomiasis, which is a disease not unique, but very particular to Egypt because of stagnant water. And not just in the Nile, of course, but also in the irrigation channels and so on. You got standing water, you've got you got mosquitoes, flies, you've got disease. So that's a downside of things. There's always a downside, right? Okay. So either way, though, life in many ways is influenced in Egypt by the Nile River. Okay. History, though. How does this get started? Well, as your textbook tells you, by about 3500 BC in the Upper Nile, and the Upper Nile means upriver, which means in the south, states had developed at Nagada and Heracleopolis. Okay. But how? How did they develop? Well, what we seems to be the case, and once again, as historians, we don't like coincidences, right? You see all these states along the Nile, we're going to assume there's something to do with the Nile, right? At the same time, we know these states that developed also the first ones to develop control of irrigation systems. All right. So how did that happen? Well, we think it happened like this. Okay. First off, I'm going to take you to Chicago in the wintertime, right? Okay. Imagine, you don't have to, but imagine you're living in Chicago in the wintertime, right? Imagine further that the city didn't plow the streets. What's going to happen? Huge mess, right? Okay. Let's say every homeowner is responsible for plowing or clearing the street in front of their house. What's going to happen? Well, it's not going to get done, right? Okay, you might have a couple of people who go out and clear the street and then, somebody else who doesn't. But it only takes a couple of people not doing it to close down the whole system, right? Okay, same thing with an irrigation system. Well, the water comes in and it needs to be channeled in canals, right? But these canals are basically, dirt ditches. The walls collapse. Plants grow up in them and block the water flow, stuff like that. They have to be built. They have to be maintained. Who's going to do that? Well, you could build it and say, okay, everybody pitch in and everybody, clean and maintain the part of the canal by your field. But there's always some clown who's not going to do it. Okay, just like there's somebody who doesn't shovel their walk in Chicago, right? That's just the way it is. But this is a little more serious than not shoveling your walk. This is life and death, right? You don't have these irrigation systems, you don't have farming, you don't have food, right? So the development of centralized government was pretty simple. It was a group of people coming together and saying, look, this is an important function. Maintaining these irrigation canals. We need somebody to be responsible for this, right? And so they're going to pick on somebody and say, you're going to be in charge of this. And then, the guy they pick is going to say, well, wait a minute. I can't be in charge of that because if I'm doing that work, how am I going to work in my fields? Right? All right. So they say, okay, we'll give you food. Right? We'll combine together, collect up food, give it to you since you can't do farming, and you'll be in charge of the irrigation system. And you say, okay, that's great. I'm going to need a workforce. Like, okay, so we're going to hire 3 or 4 guys who are going to do the work. Okay? So this is the start of government, deciding that there's some function that needs to be done. In our case, of course, it's maintaining the streets. It's schools. It's a fire department, right? And then the community coming together and deciding to pay for it. And we call this taxes. Now, back in the day, it was taxes, what was known as in kind. You would pay, 5-10% of your crop would go to the government. And then they could use that to support other people. Okay? And this is, of course, where farming is so important. Because with farming, even hoe agriculture, but the Egyptians also had plows. But even with any sort of farming, one person can produce enough food to support 3 or 4 other people. It's a surplus, right? You can produce a surplus. And what can you do with that surplus? Well, through some taxes, you can create and support a government. It also means there's going to be levels of people in society who don't have to be farming all the time, right? You can have the development of specializations. Now, what happens here then is the development of what we call a patron-client situation. The patron is the person at the top, okay? And if you're from Chicago, you know this word patronage, right? Okay? Or your ward boss or whoever else it is, okay? And then the clients are the people under them. And the clients, well, in Chicago, what do the clients get? They get jobs, for example. Okay, what does the patron get? The patron gets loyalty. They get votes and so on. Okay? But in the ancient Egyptian system, what the clients got, or as they get in any sort of patron-client state, is first and foremost security. The patron, chief, pharaoh, king, president, whoever it is, promises those individuals some level of security in exchange for what? Loyalty and taxes to provide the resources you need to run the government. Okay? So this is the development of centralized states in Africa. It's a patron-client state, okay, that developed from irrigation systems and then into towns and then into, well, a kingdom, right? A monarchy run by the pharaohs, most of whom were men, some were women. So anyway, but it starts with just these sorts of decisions here. Okay, so we see the development of states and stratified societies, society and levels. I'll show you that in just a minute. By about 3100 BC. Okay, as your textbook tells you, an individual, it's got two different names because of these inscriptions that read a little bit differently. Narmer or Menes combines the different smaller states of Egypt into one large state. And boom, we've got pharaonic Egypt. Okay, then we're going to have hierarchical stratification developing and specialization. And that means a group of pharaohs or royals, a priestly class, governors and military, scribes and tradesmen, peasants, and then slaves. And it looks something like this then. Okay, this is hierarchical. We have a hierarchy. We got somebody at the top, usually one individual or a small number of people. And then, whoops, let's go back here. And then you've got the mass of people down the hierarchy and at the bottom. All right. Oh, I like that picture of the farmers because actually I'm going to show you a picture like that here in just a minute. If you can see that closely, it shows someone doing plow agriculture. Okay. They've got a kind of a whip on a cow there who's pulling a plow. Anyway, yeah. So we're going to see craftsmen, scribes, soldiers, and so on. And we'll talk some more about these, actually mostly in the second video. All right. So the pharaohs then also undertake building monuments, and essentially monuments to themselves, because the pharaohs were not just kings, they were also living gods. And they wanted to project that power. And how do you do that? Well, monuments. Okay? Like in this case, this is Abu Simbel, great monument in southern Egypt, down on the border of Nubia. So if you're standing in Nubia looking at it, this is what you see. And this is intended to be a projection of Egyptian power, telling the Nubians, we're really strong, you need to stay out. And if they didn't get that subtle message by these huge seated statues of the pharaohs, and you can see the people at the bottom here, and these statues are, what are these statues? Must be 50, 60 feet tall, okay? They didn't get it from that subtle message. They got it from this, which is along the side of the monument at Abu Simbel is carved a row of Nubian slaves. And you can see that they're enslaved. Their hands are bound behind them, their arms are bound behind them, and they've got a cord around their necks. And basically, this is the ancient Egyptians telling the Nubians, stay in your place or this is what's going to happen to you. Okay? So once again, monumental powers, monuments are a projection of power, right? And you can see the same thing in other monuments as well. I mean, go to Washington, D.C., go to London, go all sorts of places, okay? Now, once again, this is all built on the surplus of agriculture. And we see here, this is a tomb painting, and it shows this pretty well. So we have a peasant family here. The man is plowing with oxen here, pulling the plow, and then the wife is coming behind as the plow digs in the dirt, and she's putting the seeds down behind him. And then we also see below them date palm trees, showing the agricultural abundance of Egypt here. But we also know that in addition to plowing, that they also did hoe agriculture. This is a tomb carving from the city of Luxor. Um, and the great temple complex there, built by Ramses II. And so we see that here, a row of people. And it's not clear, these may be enslaved individuals. I'm not sure. You did have slavery in Egypt, um, but not in the what's called the Old Kingdom time. It develops later. Conflicts with Nubians and so on. Some prisoners of war then would be enslaved. Um, Now, Egyptian chronology is split into, and your textbook talks about this, but they don't give you the exact dates and so on. But it's split into different time periods. We have the Archaic period here. That's when Narmer Menes emerges and unites things. And then the real kind of pharaonic Egypt starts in this Old Kingdom period. I'm looking on the bottom left here from the bottom up. And then at the end of the Old Kingdom, centralized authority disappears, and that's what's known then as the First Intermediate Period. Middle Kingdom period is when centralized authority returns. It falls again after a period in the Second Intermediate Period, and then you have what's called the New Kingdom times from 1700 or BC or so onward, where Egypt is actually at its height as far as the largest amount of land territory that it controls. Then we have another decline, the so-called Ethiopian dynasty, where Egypt is ruled actually by Nubians. Egyptians take control again, and then finally, 331 BC, the Greeks take over. And then it's the Romans and the Byzantines and so on. But all of ancient Egypt, for what we think of as pharaonic Egypt, from about 3100 BC to 331 BC, is 2,800 years. That's a long period of time, right? Okay. That is back, well, we're in 2020, right? That's basically from the time of Jesus of Nazareth to, actually it's longer than that. Till today is only 2,000 years. This is 2,800 years. So we got to go 800 years before that, okay? We actually have to go from, it's the same period of time from the Ethiopian dynasty until now. Yeah. So we did see changes during this 2,800 years. You definitely did. Your textbook talks a little bit about some of the changes in ancient Egypt. But the fact is, there was also a remarkable continuity in ancient Egypt over that period of time, with Egyptian society and especially religion. The core of it is staying unchanged over that period. Anyway, okay. I promised you we'd talk about pyramids, and we're going to talk about pyramids for a couple different reasons. First off, pyramids are cool, right? Okay. They are. And if you don't know it, and this is usually what you see. These are the pyramids at Giza. This is where the main pyramids were built outside of what is today the city of Cairo. But two things about that. One is you see the pyramids there, but the pyramids were themselves part of a larger complex, which is known as a necropolis or city of the dead. Okay, you had those three pyramids here, but you also had other cemeteries, temples, and so on built all the way around them. Okay, this whole area was built up as a cemetery complex. Okay. The pyramids, of course, are just the most obvious surviving examples of them here. The other thing to point out is the fact these were not the only pyramids. Once again, there's the ones you see, and they're all the way at the furthest north up here, where it says Giza on this map. But you see these pyramids all the way down, stretching down here. 40, I can't remember, it was 40, 50 or more pyramids stretching down here. Now, what's important here is you see where the pyramids are. You can see on the upper part of this map at the right where the river is, right? That's the Nile. Then you see the green part, which of course is the irrigated parts along the Nile. And then you see, boom, the dry part, and we're over here in the desert. These pyramids and all these cemetery complexes were built to the west of the Nile. Why is that? Well, because it's based on their religious views about the sun. Okay, and I don't know if you know ancient Egypt, Ra, the sun god. But it was thought, because the sun rises in the east, that the east then is the direction of life. But the sun, of course, then passes overhead and sets every night in the west. So essentially, the west is where the sun goes to die every day. Then it's reborn in the east every morning. But the identification then is the west is the domain of death, basically, okay? Because that's where the sun goes to die every day. So that's where they built their cemeteries and the pyramids, toward the west, okay? You've got the population areas along the river and the cemeteries to the west of that. Okay. Now, pyramids developed over a period of several hundred years. This was one of the first pyramids. This is not what's called a true pyramid, but it's what's called a step pyramid, because as you can see, it's built in steps, right? You can see different terraces, and it's basically one level on top of another, and every succeeding level, of course, is smaller. And so you get the general outline of a pyramid, but not quite a true pyramid yet. And this was built at Saqqara on about 2600 BC, designed evidently by Imhotep. So what is this? Well, pyramids, if you don't know, are tombs. They are, they're basically cemetery markers for royalty. Okay, instead of just having a headstone, though, they've got a huge monument, right? Once again, big monument, big power. Okay, this is a way of the pharaohs saying, look how important we are. Okay? And they started out, well, I say they're tombs, they're actually more like tomb coverings, because the burial itself takes place down here underground, just like, we're normally buried, right? Okay, and initially then you would have what's called a mastaba, or a slab on top of it. Part of it as a monument, and part of it to seal the tomb so grave robbers don't get into it. Okay? So then someone had this brilliant idea of, if one is good and many more are better, and then started stacking mastabas on top of each other. Okay? So you had one here, then a smaller one on top, smaller one on top, and then you've got this larger monument. Okay? And then someone else said, well, if one is good, two is better, and then built a second one over the top to make it much grander. That's what you have here with the step pyramid at Saqqara, which is also outside Egypt. Let me see if it's on that map here. Abu Ghraib, Abu Su. Yes, here we go. Saqqara is this whole area down here. Dozier, there we go. That's the step pyramid right there. Okay? All right, so it's south of Giza, and these what are known as these true pyramids up here. The other thing about the step pyramid is it wasn't built out of these massive blocks of granite like the Giza pyramids were. As you can see here, you look closely, it's a bunch of little smaller stones or bricks. Okay? All right. So what they did with the, let's go back. With the Great Pyramids here, so they did two different things. One is they built these true pyramids with the sides are triangles and so on. And they built them out of these massive stones, okay? Each one of which it weighs about 1.5 tons on average, okay? And then you get, here we go, a picture of the what's known as the Great Pyramid of Khufu. This is the largest pyramid at Giza, okay? And I'll tell you, almost everything you see in this diagram is wrong, okay? These chambers, so it's not just a solid block of rock here. There's chambers and passageways throughout it, some of which we're just still discovering, actually. But they labeled the biggest chamber the king's chamber, and the smaller chamber here the queen's chamber. Well, first off, not only is that sexist, it's nonsense, okay? Because early archaeologists assumed, oh, the big one must be for the king and the small one's for the queen. Well, no, they're not. And those are not actually burial chambers at all. Once again, the burial is underneath, down here. And there's a passage through the side of the pyramid, and you have a descending passage through here that comes down to the burial chamber here. We also, though, that's not the queen's chamber, because, whoops, let me go back here. Because that's not how it worked. Okay, you had these pyramids here for the pharaohs, who at this point were men. You had pyramids of queens, smaller pyramids along the sides of them here. Okay, and then other burial places here where it says mastabas and so on. You had smaller ones. You can kind of see it in this picture. There we go. Yeah, you can see here from this pyramid. Let's see, is that Khafre? Let me see here. Menkaure, this pyramid of Menkaure here. And you can see the pyramids of the queens alongside there. Well, one of the coolest experiences I've ever had is the first time I went to Egypt. My brother and I climbed up this pyramid, which they stopped letting you do because people were falling off and dying. So but this guy's like, comes up to us. Hey, you want to climb the pyramid? Give me $10. I'll get you up there. And he knew a route, and so we climbed up the top of this pyramid here and sat up at the top looking over the desert and so on. Great experience. So if you get a chance, I recommend it, but don't die, okay? Anyway, all right. So what are these pyramids? Once again, they are tombs, of course, for the pharaohs, but they're also monuments expressing the pharaoh's power. And as your textbook says, it's somewhat like building a large cathedral, right? Okay? Which I think, similar to this, uses a lot of resources. It's a way of expressing the power of the institution, but it's also, a way of showing the loyalty of people to this institution, right? I mean, because who's going to do the building here? It's going to be people, right? It's not slaves. It's free peasants, probably in the agricultural off season. Okay, who got paid extra and fed and so on to work on these pyramids. And the Great Pyramid here took about 20 years to build. Okay, all right, I'm going to end there. This is a link to the BBC video I want you to see. That's also in the weekly agenda. I'm going to stop here. There's going to be a second video I want you to look at, which is going to talk about sources for Egyptian history. You're going to need that to fill out that primary source evaluation form on the Herodotus reading. All right, thank you.